You're listening to the Exhibitionist podcast, hosted by Nicola Reader and brought to you by inspiringexhibitors.com and Pro Extra, a wholly owned subsidiary of 12th Man Solutions Limited.
Hi there and welcome to episode 24 of the Exhibitionist podcast. I'm your host, Nicola Reader, and as always, thank you so much for joining us and thank you for listening in. Very shortly, we're going to hand over to our conversation with Andy Hickinbotham, who's a sales director at GES. And Andy will be talking to us about stand design, but also about how to use events strategically and some of the tips and tricks that he's learnt in decades working around the exhibition industry. Before we get to that, though, I just wanted to touch on something that I was inspired by from a brilliant feature in the latest edition of Exhibition News magazine. And that's an article by Jill Hawkins, who's a director of Aniseed PR. And it focuses on why is the exhibition industry so obsessed with visitor numbers. And this came on the back of us starting to work with clients getting ready for events and exhibitions that are kicking off in Q1 of 2020. So we're sitting down and we're talking to clients, and it's happened a couple of times in the last couple of weeks, where the first question we ask them is, what do you want to get out of this exhibition? What does success look like for you? And I've mentioned it before, but a number of those clients have said, we just want to meet loads of new contacts. Well, for a start, that's not very measurable, but is it actually realistic as well? So there does seem to be an emphasis from exhibitors on meeting lots of people at a show. And I think in some ways it's just a very easy objective to say, yep, we're investing money because we want new business, therefore that must mean we have to meet lots of people to do that. But as we stated before, there's an industry statistic, which is easy for me to say, that suggests about 16 to 20% of a total population, visitor population that is, at a show, will be in a position to buy from an exhibitor at any point in time. So even if you speak to loads of people, only 16 to 20% of them are really going to be in any position to buy from you as an organisation. The phrase that really struck a chord with me in Jill's brilliant article, and I'm going to quote this, was, exhibitions are about making business contacts and lasting relationships. So why do we measure their worth directly after the show when we still don't know their full impact? The point there being, exhibitions are about making business contacts and lasting relationships. If you speak to loads of people at your stand, there's a good chance that 80% of them will never fall into that category of making long-lasting, sustainable and profitable business relationships. They're actually just a waste of time, and that's okay. People are quite surprised when we say it's 16 to 20% of your audience that will probably buy from you, because it feels like quite a small number. But we have a client getting ready to go to a big industry show over in Hanover in a couple of weeks, at which there'll be 130,000 people. Even if they spoke to the full 16 to 20% of that total visitor audience who are in a position to buy from them, it's still far more customers than they could deal with based on the resource that they've got. And therefore, what we're trying to help them do before they go to EMO is think about, actually, who do we want to do business with? Who are the right kind of clients for us? How do we get those meetings in the diary before we get there? Who are the people who are most likely to buy with us from us most quickly? Who do we want to build partnerships with, supply partnerships, etc.? So it's really thinking about the quality of those meetings and those relationships and those connections rather than the quantity. And I think Jill is very fair and balanced in her article in talking about exhibition organisers using the number and the quantity of visitors as a way of discussing and celebrating success of their show. And that's because that's kind of what exhibitors have wanted to hear for a long time. I certainly know when I was working for big corporate companies and we were doing exhibitions, we wanted to back the shows that had lots and lots of people going, perhaps when we were less aware of actually needing to find the quality rather than the quantity. And a lot of exhibitors are still very much in this mindset of we need to meet lots of people. And if exhibitors are saying that's the important number to us, then that's what event organisers are going to measure it on. But it does feel like there's a change happening in the industry now. And exhibitors, as well as event organisers, are really keen to think about, okay, how do we measure success in a different way? How do we find a way to talk about those sustainable, long-lasting business relationships that are actually creating sales transactions? And that, I think, is another really key point that Jill makes in her article, where she talks about advertising and digital marketing are both measured using far more complex metrics that calculate fully the ROI of the campaign, but we don't do it in exhibitions yet. And maybe we don't do it because it feels like a little bit too hard work. We don't have the tools in place. We don't have the processes. We don't go through the right steps in terms of planning for a show to actually then at the end of it be able to think, okay, have we got the information that we need to be able to measure more than just the number of people that we've seen or the number of people who have turned up? And that's, again, also feels like the missing bit of the equation. So shout out to anybody who thinks they have a brilliant platform or software or method or process for being able to really clearly measure ROI for exhibitors and for event organisers. We would love to have you on the show talking about what those metrics are and how exhibitors can think more strategically about how they measure ROI. So measuring ROI is certainly not something that is new to the exhibitions industry. If you've read this week's blog over on the Inspiring Exhibitors website, you'll know I sat down with James Musgrave this week, who is the head of the UK Centre for Events Management over at Leeds Beckett University. And he's been around exhibitions and events for decades. And we talked about all that had changed and we talked about all that hasn't changed in the industry. And in both our experiences, one thing that hasn't changed is we just don't measure events brilliantly. And I think that's really a key issue, that we think it can't be done. We think it's too much hard work, therefore we don't do it. So this is really a shout out from me. If you are an exhibitor or an event organiser that's planning for Q4 this year or going into 2020, please do give us a shout if you need some help thinking about how you structure those SMART objectives really early on that then enable you to measure an effective ROI at the back end of your show. It can be done. It's not easy, but it takes a little bit of planning up front. So hopefully that's been useful, and I would encourage you to go and read Jill's article in Exhibition News. I found it really useful and really honest, which was great to see that reality. So moving on, I will hand over now to our conversation with Andrew. As I say, he's Sales Director over at GES. Apologies if there are some slight little glitches on the sound quality. As you'll hear from the conversation, Andy was sat in a beautiful building, but those big old buildings don't always necessarily lend themselves to the best sound quality. So enjoy the conversation. So on this week's edition of the Exhibitionist podcast, we are delighted to have invited Andy Hickinbotham, the Sales Director for GES, onto the show. So Andy, welcome to the show.
Hello, nice to see you.
And for those of you who obviously can't see what I can see at the moment, Andy is in the most amazing surroundings with gears and cogs and all sorts of things in an old mill, and it looks fascinating. I wish it was as exciting where I'm working. So nice location, Andy.
It is. It's a lovely place to live. Grade 2 listed, dilapidated, bit tatty, but we very much like it. You just have to be very, very careful because I'm 6'3", and there's lots and lots of low stuff in this house, so it's easy to smash your head on poles and gears and cogs and anything. So yeah, it looks amazing. it's a nice place, but it hurts.
I like it. So before we get into too much talking about kind of stand design and areas that you can help exhibitors, which is the main theme of today's conversation, just give me a little bit of background about your experience, Andy, and the current role that you're working in.
Yeah, cool. So long ago, I was a designer. Well, I trained as a designer. I did a degree in 3D design, interior and architecture, or interior architecture really was the core of it. So I'm a trained designer, but after a few years I was selling things rather than designing things, which was fine, and it was a mixture of the two. So I went straight into events effectively, never really done anything else. So exhibitions being the core of that. So I worked for a small company for 6 or 7 years, then I worked for a very, very big company, biggest in the industry, Silver Knight. Then I went back to a smaller company and helped to grow that, and then I'm now working for GES. So I've been quite lucky to see the big and small of the industry, both in terms of client size as well as the operational sort of size of how stuff works and how stuff gets delivered. Lots of work with agencies, so I'm quite exposed to the more brand-based rather than MDF-based side of the industry, which is obviously quite a nice balance between the two. So yeah, it's been a commercial role really all the way through, with obviously exhibitions has been the core, live events, experiential, coming off that for obvious reasons of the way the market has developed, but also TV, museums, sat in a room that looks like a museum. Museums has been fantastic over the years, not so much now, but lots of museum and visitor interaction, visitor experience work worldwide. So that's been good fun, and lots of other stuff that spins off those that people don't really talk about. But retail is a fantastic sector that cross-pollinates from exhibiting really, really well. So I have been lucky to work with companies that have tried and indeed succeeded in going into those other areas. So yeah, my current role as a GES sales director is effectively a couple of years ago, we started up a new venture which was called Show Ready, and that's effectively a packaged, pre-designed range of exhibition stands to help not only exhibitors coming out of shell scheme and going into space only for the first time, but also we have lots of exhibitors that we work with who are large-scale exhibitors, but they need the smaller option while they crack on with the bigger stand. So the ability there is to scale up and down and keep brand continuity, lots of dialogue. People who are time poor obviously love it because it's very quick to market. So it's a very interesting progression in those terms, because it's almost back to basics in terms of what really, really works well on a sort of sharpened pencil approach to using a few square meters sometimes, but very, very effectively. So yeah, it's a rounded approach which has brought me here.
Very good. And as people, regular listeners to the podcast and also readers of the blog will know, we were recently over at the Game of Thrones exhibition in Belfast. Yes, I am throwing that one in again, but I believe that was a GES delivery as well of that project. So really, really interesting time we had over there. So and when I found out that it was GES that were doing it, it was just interesting to see the scope of everything that you guys as a company get involved in.
Yeah, it's a fantastic project. It's come off the back of several others. We did the Avatar touring worldwide show. Harry Potter is the other obvious one. That was the first one. And there are others in foot all the time. So we have a fantastic GES US-based approach GES events. And they do some amazing, I would call that experiential work, even though it's a bit more than that, actually. It brings in retail, it brings in all sorts. So as a venture, it's a fantastic extension of some of the other slightly more mundane things we do, brought together as one sort of cohesive lump of experiential, and it is really, really good. So I think it will continue, it will tour, it will grow, it will move. So obviously tied into whatever is currently very much media-wise on trend, but as a business, it's a fantastic experience.
Yeah, and I think that was the point we were making to kind of listeners and readers when we were talking about it, was just thinking about some of those consumer experiential points, and how do you bring some of those elements through into, as you say, what can be seen as a little bit more of a traditional, more formal B2B environment. Well, what were the things that really we loved and we were buzzing about that actually you could see come into life in an exhibition hall? And that, I think, for you as a company is probably where that breadth and that experience is really crucial to working with exhibition clients.
Absolutely, because whether you're spending £2,000 or £3,000 on a shell scheme conversion, or £1 million on a stand at Mobile World Congress, or anything in between, doesn't really matter. You've really got to think of the visitor experience, but also the memory they take away. The memory could be a smell, it could be a texture, it could be a piece of interaction on the stand, it could be a person, of course. People do buy off people, but they also buy off emotion. So you may take away a lot of pride, you may take away a lot of envy, a lot of greed. They're all really good buying levers that work really, really well in a 3D environment where you've got all those at least 5 senses going. So yeah, you're right. Where you actually, if you think like a visitor, you'll probably walk away from the show with more tangible ROI.
Absolutely. That's kind of our whole philosophy when we're talking to clients, is put yourself in the visitor's shoes.
Absolutely, and it's easily forgotten. And you have some, I won't name them, but there's some very, very experienced, big money spending exhibitors in the world, in this country certainly, who don't do that, and perhaps wonder why their campaigns don't. They might be successful in one terms, but they may not succeed in pure monetary terms, or even sort of general ROO and ROI terms, because they're not thinking like a visitor, they're thinking like a marketer, and it's not quite the same thing, obviously.
Absolutely. And so, thinking of stand design, when we work with clients, it's very often where people spend most of their time and most of their money when they're getting ready for a trade show. But going to the very basics of, you've decided which show you want to go to, you're now at that point of thinking, how much floor space do I need? Shall I go shell? Shall I go space only? What do I do? What are the first things that an exhibitor should be thinking through before they decide what the right space is for them, and whether that is a shell or whether it's just space only?
Yeah, it's a good starting question, really, isn't it? Because you are investing in a show. It's like buying a house in a way, isn't it? You're buying some real estate, then you're going to decide what to build on it. So I have regular experiences where people have not got enough space for what they feel they need to do, maybe not what they want to do, what they need to do. And certainly the other way around, where even just yesterday, I was speaking to somebody who probably had booked too much space and they're now struggling to find a budget to fill it. They'll either end up with something which is out of balance and just looks as if one of the lorries didn't turn up, or they'll look up with something which is very low quality, because you have that price, design, quality triangle, that conundrum of pick any two that you see on LinkedIn all the time. It's very true. It works very, very proficiently, really, in our industry. So really, if you book too much space, you're going to struggle to fill it. But if you don't book enough, you're going to probably have too many staff on the stand. Likely, no one will get on. So the first real conundrum is what to book in terms of space. Position is obviously key as well, because obviously it may well be the case that the most fantastic position in a certain show is near the entrance, but not necessarily, because very rarely do I walk into an exhibition when I'm visiting or show walking for whatever reason and stop straight away. Not necessarily, unless I've been queuing outside where I might want a coffee or something, might be a bit tired. So sometimes people get very, very het up about position in a hall. Depending on the show, it can be vital, and on some shows, it doesn't matter in the slightest, because the show is so small that everybody will pretty much see everything. So that's probably one of the first decisions, is amount of space and position. In terms of shell or space only, there is a general underlying trend, let's call it, where people start off with on the sort of exhibition incline, if you see what I'm saying, where they start off with, say, a pop-up or a banner stand in a shell scheme and migrate through shell scheme enhancement through to maybe packages such as show ready or others, and then go through eventually maybe to design and build, and then onto something, maybe they're building a worldwide program. Obviously, that's rare when people go right to the scale, but a lot of people move up and down that scale for the wrong or right reasons. And normally the reason is they've run out of room, so they can't do as much on their 3x4 shell scheme anymore, so they're upgrading. But very often it's because they're either they've become almost uninvested in the show, and they want to try something more, maybe take one more shot at the show, maybe move in the show at the same time, going back to point number one, where they're sort of using the show to actually almost generate new business around the show, and actually the investment is therefore in the change rather than the throw of the dice, let's call it. But a lot of the time, the migration from shell to space can obviously be for the right reason, but occasionally you do find people who've maybe taken that space only jump and not maximised it. Not that they haven't spent enough money, but maybe they haven't taken enough time. And the three things that we find on Show Ready, for example, as well as many other package options, I'm sure, are that there are three, if you like, categories of people that come to us or that want the service that we offer. The people that are time poor, the people that are experience poor, so they just haven't been through that process before, or obviously the people who are budget poor in their terms and think they're going with the cheaper option for only that reason. The mixture of those three is usually the best reason to actually move on up the scale, is to actually get more, literally get more than you thought you could achieve, which is a nice phrase, sounds lovely from a marketing point of view. It actually does mean something, because if you get more than you think you can achieve, it's a bit like getting a free something when you buy something. It's that added value all the time, isn't it? So I think the migration into space only is certainly the key for us in terms of seeing exhibitors grow through the change. But there are some fantastic exhibitors who've only ever taken shell scheme and do very, very well at the shows they attend.
So from what you're saying, I think it makes sense in terms of if somebody's kind of new to exhibiting, taking a shell scheme, because sometimes it can seem a little bit safer, and a lot of those decisions and things that you could get wrong, like walls and electrics and all that kind of stuff, is managed for you, and so it's slightly less risky. You move up to space only then when you've grown and that you feel more comfortable and confident, and that seems to make sense. But are there companies that move from space only back to shell, and why would they maybe consider doing that?
Yeah, there are. And there are a few reasons. One is that you might be maybe under pressure from your peers or your seniors to maybe spend less. It's a simple one. Spend less this year. We want to do an extra show, so spend less on this show. Split your 20 grand in two and do two 10 grand spend shows. That's a total budget that might have to include the space as well. So there's a tangible sort of budget-based reason why you might be spending less, or even moving back to shell scheme is a natural extension of spending less. Another may be that you've booked late and there is no space only plots available. Only the shell scheme locations in a certain show might be available, but you still really want to have an attendance at that show. So that your hand may be forced. It might be that even with friendly, helpful organisers, there may just not be a spot for you in the right location, or indeed some shows only have areas that are only shell space, which is what I was driving at. Well, there are other reasons as well. You may want to test a market, and you may just want to throw, instead, a bit similar to point number one, you might want to spend a little bit less money on more shows and actually spread it over several shows, ready for the next year to define which one proved, best ROI. Therefore, it's almost like an investment test just to see what works best. Or again, it might go back to one of those three reasons. You might have a new staff member who's only ever in the marketing team who maybe has only ever worked on shelf schemes, and their comfort zone means that they get a lot out of shelf scheme, and maybe it's a wise move to keep them for that first year, for example, in that comfort zone. Up the prowess of the shelf scheme by using the best enhancements you can, and actually do it for almost personal reasons, so or manpower reasons. So I think there can be a variety of reasons, but we do see quite a lot of big corporates. I've recently had companies such as BASF and Toshiba who've come back to shelf scheme. Who've come back to show ready from full scale space only, and the reason is they do want to concentrate on that bigger show later in the year, so they want the snap to option at certain events to actually take the pressure off and make it a seamless, simple process, which is the reason why we started it, or one of the reasons. So yeah, again, sometimes there can be a quality business reason behind something that looks quite aesthetic.
And the thing that I think I would pick out from that we often talk with our clients around is it being a proactive choice rather than something you're forced into. So be realistic about what budget you need to do something well. Give yourself enough time to do it, and then you shouldn't have to compromise on a budget. You shouldn't have to compromise on what's left on the show floor or how many people you take or what it looks like. It's being really honest up front about what are we doing this show for? How much do we need to spend on it? What space do we need? And actually, if you don't have those things available, you don't have the time, you don't have the experience, you don't have the people, you don't have the money, maybe think about whether exhibiting is even the right thing for you to be doing.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And there's an old rule of thumb, which I think might be a bit out of date these days, but it's still worth mentioning, that people should generally spend the same, certainly on space only, the same on filling the stand as they did on buying the space. Yeah. So I think that it's not a straight line graph. That definitely doesn't work at the very, very small scale, and without a doubt doesn't work at 250 square meters plus. It just would, the maths just wouldn't really work out for most customers, most exhibitors. But one thing I do think is that the elephant in the room, which is budget, is very, very often in our industry, and a bit wider than our industry as well. You almost don't want to talk about it because there's a certain level of embarrassment. We're not very good at talking about money as a species, and it definitely comes out as a problem with exhibiting sometimes. It is part of the brief. It's not an optional extra, in my view, even if it's a low estimate from an exhibitor. It helps enormously. As long as you're talking to somebody you trust in terms of as a supplier, then I think that the trust element overrides it, and vocalizing a budget or a budget range is massively helpful for the designer of the company who's you're going to be working with. How on earth do they start? Unless you're talking about an absolutely price-pointed packaged product where you can treat it like a price list and say, right, that equals that. Is that too much? No, we'll go for that. And it's a different starting point. But I think budget's often talked about as being something that's a bit of a pain, really, because exhibitors don't like to talk about it. I think some do. People like to buy, but they don't like to be sold to. That's the difference. There's another great phrase that applies to our industry fantastically well. And they do buy for emotion. If they see something that they didn't think they could afford, that's a fantastic trigger for them to genuinely get more out of their experience. I don't really do that many stands, I don't think, these days, or we as a company really, where they're one-offs. We usually see people again, or we've seen them before, and that's brilliant, because we want to make the economic sustainability of the industry is just as important as the ecological sustainability of the industry and the social side. We want exhibitors who succeed, get more out of it, stay within it, grow it. So it's there are some moral reasons there as well.
Yeah, and it's frustrating sometimes when you talk to an exhibitor who has just spent £10,000 on booking some space, and then they say, yeah, and I've now got £1,000 to activate that. How do I do it? And you just think you just kind of wasted £10,000, because with £1,000 space, what are you going to do with £1,000 now to bring that to life? And people come to us and say, how can you save me money? And that's not what we're here to do. Exhibitions are big, expensive, time-consuming, tiring events. And if you're not serious about investing in it, then actually you've got to think whether it's the right tactic. It's not something you're going to save money on. It's not that sort of a tactic.
That's right. And it may be that they've fallen into that with the best intentions, because it's not always a moment of sort of almost stupidity. It's almost sometimes naivety. going back to that lack of experience thing that I was talking about before. And we find that quite a lot, where maybe just being the person who spends the extra half an hour with the client to actually help them out of the hole is the thing that keeps that client with you for 20 years. That does happen. And people do remember that effort. So, some people don't have the time to spend that effort. If you have the time to spend the effort, in my book, it definitely comes back to help you. So, I think some exhibitors can fall into that trap and think, I just don't have enough money left. Sometimes it's for something pretty important, such as staff accommodation and travel and coffee, and that's budgeting. That's no different to home finances, really. But people aren't very good at that either.
Yeah, absolutely. So regardless of shell or scheme or what anybody books, what are the sort of 3 or 4 key tips that you would give to exhibitors when they're starting to think about designing their stand and what they want it to look like?
That's the key, isn't it, really? I think it doesn't matter whether you're a small engineering company working out of a very small unit in Kettering. No offense to Kettering there, by the way. Or whether you're, Lockheed Martin or Total, you're a brand. So I think one of the first rules is just remember that. Keep it on brand, however loose or tight that can be, whether you've got brand guidelines or whether the brand guidelines are in your head. Try and keep it on brand. It's never really a great idea to try and pretend to be something you're not. It can be a bit of a release exhibiting, because you can, but that leads you down a certain sort of path of theming and gimmicks, and then things start to go wrong, and it's like, well, what's this got to do with lasers? And it can go a bit strange when you see exhibiting that's gone a bit too far off plot. So I think keeping it off brand, using themes correctly but sparingly, I suppose it sounds a bit pessimistic, but sparing use of themes can be a very, very good. It's sort of easier to flesh it out than pull it back. Once you've gone too far, it's difficult to come back, but you can always add a little bit more content there. So you see some very good theming, but it needs to be a very strong brand behind it, otherwise the values disappear. One bold idea, one strong idea is obviously always a good thing. From a psychological point of view, if people walk onto a stand and there's a simple but clear idea, whether it be a colour or a message or whatever it happens to be, if you're bold and you're confident in that one idea, that confidence tends to exude through to the visitor, which is why you're there. And I think that could be something such as, instead of one big plasma, instead of going for the obvious, biggest LED or plasma screen we can afford, 55-inch, let's go for 2 or 3 smaller ones and repeat the image. Therefore, the confidence in repetition has a certain value to the approaching visitor. The instant reaction before you've even thought about it is, well, it must be good because they've repeated it 3 times. Mm-hmm. That's coming from retail. I saw Nike do that years and years ago with rows of plasmas showing the same feed, and you don't even necessarily even look at the content. It must be good because they've repeated it so many times. There's a certain sort of recency bias to it, and you can understand that that might filter its way through to exhibiting, and that works really, really well with smaller scale AV, which is effectively cheaper these days than it used to be. So it's an accessible thing for shell scheme exhibitors as well as space only. And then there are a few other things: imagery, scale, context. It goes back to theming a little bit, but using really big faces on stands, smiling faces, happy, joyous people who are, I'm not talking about the staff, I'm talking about the imagery. That can be very, very powerful. Knocking things into black and white can be powerful for the certain reasons. Changes in scale, things that are out of context. These are all sort of easy psychological triggers that, if you can build it again back into the first point about making sure it's still generally on brand, they can be really, really powerful, especially from a distance. When you're changing in scale, you can see something in the distance that looks sort of interesting 40 feet away. You're probably going to take a closer look when you get 6 feet away. And that leads to the last one, I would say, which is texture and colour and detailing. When you're on a stand, you could have a very, very simple stand. Maybe you're the guy who ran out of budget, I don't know, but 1 or 2 nice features on the stand that are subtle but visual enough to remember. They can be really powerful, because that could bring me back to my earlier, I just touched on the idea of smell, aroma. If you've got an aroma on a stand, whether it be car leather, new coffee, coffee, or cut grass, or something more themed, obviously, that could be a great trigger, because your factory glands obviously will give you that memory for a long time. And if you could then pick up on that with some post-show advertising or marketing, to you the guys with the really good coffee, or you were the guys that smelled of, I don't know, medieval rope. It's a tie back into a marketing campaign, isn't it? And as long as it's all considered as a campaign with the show in the middle, not just the show on its own, then you've got some real chance of driving some ROI out of the show. But yeah, detailing is a really good one. And an example recently, I went to a stand which was very, very plain. I can't remember what the show was, but it was I think it was P&M series, I think it was IFSEC. And there was a stand that was very, very simple. I was only there as a visitor walking around, and we hadn't built it. But it had a really, really nice porthole on the door. And it was a sort of teardrop shape, a kidney shape. And I'm a big advocate of quality portholes, weird that sounds. And I remember it now. I've just used it as an example, so it must have been good. That was in June. So several months later, I remember the quality porthole. And it was a requirement. You have to have a porthole on the door in most shows, especially at IFSEC, health and safety-based show. So the fact that you remember it becomes the trigger, doesn't it? It's those little tiny things, the quality of the detailing on a counter, some laminates and backlighting. It could be the best 500 quid you spend. You might spend 50 grand on a stand or 10 grand on a stand, but just spending a few £100s on something of that nature could be the little trigger that helps you the most. So detailing is probably a really, really good one for all scales of exhibitor to choose and think about.
Yeah, and it's interesting you talk about those small details. One thing that we've seen, I think it was a Specialty Fine Food last year, so going back nearly 12 months, and the kind of small exhibitors, small food brands, just wallpapering their stands and then putting up picture frames and some of their messaging in, which you think, if your messaging might change, printing big graphic boards every time is pretty expensive. But actually, if you just cleverly use nice picture frames, arty picture frames, and you can just change the messages every time, it's like, how simple and smart is that from, what's quite a small exhibitor? They hadn't used a big design agency, they'd just come up with it themselves. And it's like, actually, that's the kind of creativity that smaller businesses, smaller exhibitors need to go with. So
absolutely. And to that graphic point, that is the reason 2 years ago why, when we started Show Ready, it was specifically tensioned graphics, tensioned fabric graphics based, was because you do start to get then an economy of cost on scale. Basically, you've got some large areas of graphic real estate that can really, really work well with a great graphic layer. Can't really be beaten in terms of aesthetics. But you're right, smaller scale frames is a great idea. We did some a couple of years ago, I think, for a venue. I think it was the brewery, where that we used sort of imagery at that scale, and it's great because it's interchangeable. You can almost mix it up. You can put it on Jotty angle. There's loads of little things. And I think if you just get into the mold of thinking about it in those creative terms, it's easy to come up with ideas yourself. And as part of a small marketing team, which probably involves the sales team that will be on the stand as well, that's always a good idea. Furniture again, another one. Go for furniture, fantastic, but maybe have two different heights of furniture, so you give people a choice as they walk up. They can flop down in the sofa and have half an hour chatting to you, or if they want to get straight to business, they can perch on the stools and be a little bit more 10 to 20 minute business like. So choice again, simple. A lot of it is just pure psychology, and some of it is physics. It's a mixture of that art and science that really makes it work, really. But
I think one of the good things you were saying, you're just wandering around, not a show that you were working on or that anything that you'd built. And that's a really good tip for anybody working in exhibitions, is just go and look at another show that is nothing to do with your industry, because then you won't get caught up in the baggage of competitors or suppliers, but just go in something completely different and have a walk around another exhibition and just see what you like, see how quickly you get the messaging, see who's doing things differently, what was the kind of tech that you liked, what was the tech that was completely redundant and irrelevant, and just get some inspiration really from other shows. I guess you do that quite a lot in your job.
Well, I can, but it's terrible because it's an excuse, isn't it? But yeah, we do generally as a part of the business, we do get out to a lot of shows. We see what works and what doesn't work. You're always learning, but you are right. I have to say, some of the best stands I've ever worked on, designed, built, however you want to phrase it, have been effectively using elements that were taken from other sectors. So, for example, water walls. Early 2000s, people were using falling water walls a lot to generate imagery in water, and it was fantastic. Don't see it so much now, but it started to come out of automotive into defence and aerospace. Then you see pharmaceutical companies using certain sorts of augmented sort of AR, VR sort of side of things. It's become fairly easy to move around in terms of taking it from sector to sector. But I totally agree. It's boat shows, motor shows, they're fantastic. They might be completely irrelevant to selling watering cans and paper clips, but if you go there and you see something working, that's why I use that cross-pollination word. It really does sort of allow you to think, maybe, well, if it's working over there for the guy who's just spent £1,500 pounds per square metre, then maybe it'll work for me on a smaller scale. And you do find that that's the reason why so much technology in cars has come out of Formula One. That is the reason, because so much investment goes back down through the chain. And you could argue it's the same metaphor of trying to spot things in those big hero sector shows, Goodwood Festival of Speed, whatever it happens to be, and then bring it back to the smaller, slightly more, straight to the point shows, trade shows, let's call them, where you wouldn't expect that. Because the new to market approach has got a value on its own. It's just something. Oh, that's different. That's fine. That's really good. Maybe in 2 years, everybody will be doing it. To do it now. So it's you bang on. Visiting shows is a very, very it's a very good discipline for any marketeer who's got an event budget. It really is, even if they're in a different sector.
Absolutely. So we've been quite positive there, looking at all the hints and tips about how to help people. Can you give us 2 or 3 things of absolute horrors that you see exhibitors' mistakes that they're still making?
A lot of them won't surprise you because they're the opposite of some of the things I've said. So, for example, you walk onto a stand and you don't walk onto a stand. You can't get on the bloody stand because, actually, I'm allowed to swear.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can't get on the stand because that only just counts. You can't get on the stand because there's so much furniture, there's so much interactivity, there's so much content, and there's so many staff. That's a nightmare because you really have to make a certain assumption that what you're going to do is work and people will actually want to come onto your stand. And it's very easy to walk around a show and see the exhibitor who's got 20 to 30 staff on a very large stand, and you just don't want to go on because you're going to get jumped on. It's this is car phone warehouse technology here, and you're just going to get hijacked. So that's a real no for me. Staff sat at the back eating sandwiches, playing Angry Birds is never going to be great. So staff training is a real bugbear. If you're going to send someone to a stand to do a job, they need to know why they're there, what not to do, and even if they've been in the business 30 years, they can absolutely still get it wrong. So there's an element of sense to that, but a lot of it actually comes from training for the right reasons and actually sending people there with the right investment of time. But in more physical terms, over imagery. So there's a certain point where there's just too much going on, and it's like walking down Earls Court Road. There's just way too much red, and it just makes you feel hungry too quick. And there's just way too much graphics, and what's going on? Messaging that's polluting each other, where there's sort of divergent messages on different parts of the same stand that sort of send you in different directions. Again, the corollary of that point I made earlier about one big idea, one bold idea. So getting any of those original benefits, the flip side is definitely most of that list. But also, there's some basic stuff in terms of human interaction. So, you need staff that are going to walk up to someone and be engaging with them and smile and do that sort of stuff. And that's very, very important because you could have the most fantastic stand in the world, but if there's nobody smiling and available, and that comes down to staffing numbers as well, then you've shot it because they're unlikely to walk away with anything unless you've got some sort of really good data interaction there where they can, touch and connect or take some data away. But that's passive. You don't know who's necessarily the quality of that last person who wandered off. So I think there's a stand management thing comes back into most of these, and added to the sort of graphic horrors that you see constantly. Lighting's another one. You can have the most fantastic stand but underlight it. And it works the other way around as well. You can have a pretty ropey stand and light it really, really well and make it look okay. That's a very known trick. I don't think that's no secret really. I think most people understand that lighting is challenging, and it is challenging, especially with shell scheme exhibiting, because there is only so many lighting options that you have. We've got quite a few now. It's grown enormously in the last couple of 3 years as GES, but it's still, it has a limit. There's only certain amounts of things you can add and do and upscale, and some you can't. So by definition, you're more limited, obviously. But even with a space only stand, you can struggle to light large surfaces effectively rather than just spotlighting individual parts.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah,
horrors. It's music to my ears hearing the staff training point, because obviously it's some of the work we do, and you walk into some of those training courses sometimes, and people who've done exhibitions for years and years, they sat there with their arms folded. You can't teach me anything. I know it all. And it's amazing how just with a couple of statistics and a couple of videos of things, they very quickly start thinking, I hadn't thought of it in the visitor's footsteps, actually. And I didn't realise that would make a difference. And actually, I didn't realise saying that wasn't really what a visitor was looking for. And there's so much that you can learn. We've been in exhibitions, 20, 30 years, and you still learn every single time you go to one. So I think that point is really crucial about that staff training, even if your team are saying, yeah, but we know it, we've done this for years and years. There's always something that somebody can learn to just be better on the stand. Yeah. So
one really good trick, actually, which is you very rarely see, but I've mentioned it a few times, is when you're set up, you're finished, you're ready to go home, go to the pub, go to the hotel. Actually, do a few walks from the entrance to your stand. See what you see on the way. Is there anything that's polluting your message on the way, so that when you get to your stand, something I saw 20 yards ago seems to be, I don't know, interfering with it.
Right.
Is the furniture in the right position as you walk up, or does it stop you getting on? Does the lighting need tweaking? Are there any competitors in certain positions that we just need to make the staff aware of for day one? Because we can't do anything about them, so awareness becomes the better option then. So just walking through the show as well as around the show, just to see who else is doing what, is a really, really strong one, especially if you're in a show, say at the NEC Hall 5, where you might be a fair distance away from the entrance. Walk that journey a couple of times with your team just to see, in different ways, and converge at the stand just to see what the approaches are like. Because you can make some last minute, very, very small changes right at the death, or even show morning. It's probably better actually, just when everybody's got all their stuff out. It's a battlefield, isn't it? It's a competitive environment. You're there to win. So that's a really nice little easy trick that you can do to just make sure that even at that 11th hour, you've squeezed everything out of the event you can, and then start trading as such, marketing.
Absolutely great tip, great advice. And so we've talked a little bit about tech, and one of the things that frustrates me a little bit when I'm walking around exhibitions is seeing tech for tech's sake. So where people have been are using a new bit of VR or AR or whatever it might be, because they think it's cool, but it doesn't add any relevance, it doesn't add anything to the customer experience. So what are the good kind of tech trends that you're seeing coming through in terms of any of that kind of AI or augmented reality or virtual realities? Is there anything that you think is really going to be the next big thing in exhibitions?
Those are the main three you see at the moment, without a doubt. Augmented reality, the first time I used that was on a Citroen stand years ago, where we just held up an iPad and it showed a vehicle spinning on a plinth that wasn't actually there. And for that show, it was incredible because it was so new to market. They'd invested in it, and credit to them, they'd invested in the right thing, because it was that sort of wow factor, that instant, ooh, that's cool. And that's great, but it only obviously lasts so long. VR is moving on all the time, and it will obviously get to a point now where, or very soon, sorry, where it becomes not just more compact, but also faster and more variants. And you can obviously run it as a campaign across multiple shows, and you can share content in different ways. So I'm not a tech expert, but what I see is the effects. I think that in a way that's almost more beneficial in a way. So you actually see people using that sort of tech. We did a stand at Railtex a few months ago where there was a VR element to the stand. And in the rail industry, that's really, really interesting, because they've taken something very mundane in terms of whatever it happens to be, track laying or integration with signals or whatever it happens to be. And this is a real nuts and bolts company we were working for. They sold stuff, not just services, but they were using it to immerse, quite literally, in an experience. Buyers who don't necessarily get to wear that headset very often, and for them, going to that show is this is the rail industry. This is their big moment of the year. This is the show. So giving them that moment of sort of experiential isn't just to do with actually sending them away having placed an order, but also sending them back thinking they had a better experience on that stand, which again is where other things such as the smell things comes back in, those other little triggers that I mentioned before. But in terms of tech, there are some little things that have sort of coming and going, really. They're not continual. Last couple of years ago, we saw some interesting things with products where you can jump up and down and generate energy, which is quite cool. So you can jump up and down on what looks like a floor tile and generate energy. You see a bar rising on a screen, and when it gets to a certain point, take a selfie and it sends it to your Facebook. Those little sort of things.
Nice.
I must admit, I've forgotten the brand name, but there's a couple available. It's not just one now. Those are nice little triggers because they generate a certain amount of interest on the sustainability side. It's a bit like running on the spot to get your free tube tickets, which we've seen in various countries. So there's various sort of semi-physical, semi-digital interactives that I think are more interesting actually than the pure digital stuff.
Yeah.
Touchscreen technology and touch screens, touch tables, which effectively is just a horizontal version, the Minority Report style, are still quite popular, and for the right products, sort of X-ray versions of that as well, where the screen passes in front of a product and shows the inside of the product. It's false, but it looks very, very real.
Yeah.
And again, really nice examples of that, but they're expensive. It's not the tech that's the expense; it's the back end, it's the program, and it's the setup. So there's a real investment of not just value, but also space and time there as well in terms of whether it's worth it to soak up probably a very large amount of a small budget. Could be, but there's a real leap of faith there. But in terms of new tech coming through, I mean, there's stuff all the time. We do a really good event every year called Event Tech Live, which is for our industry, where we have our own, part in it. So we have our own stand and we do our own speaker sort of events and sort of presentations there. And we're always talking about things, whether it be Giant iTab or Visit and Poken, which are the Visit applications that GES run. So they're all to do with a mixture of data. Gamification's a really good one. People playing is great. People like to win, so give them a chance. People playing games on stands, whether it's collecting information, collecting, people's business cards and data, that's all leading towards a certain element of gamification, which is more to do with reward, and therefore the reward might be information, or it might be actually a tangible thing, a mouse mat, or anything like that. So I think the intertwining of physical and digital is really where it's at, really, at the moment. But it does move on very quickly. This could be completely out of date in 6 months' time, because things do move on that quickly, and you've really got to contend with the fact that it's the quickly that is the benefit, rather than the fact that it was either in date or out of date. And that's quite challenging when people expect an industry to know what's coming next. Not necessarily. So it's there's quite a lot going on all the time.
And I think the challenge is with you saying things are moving so quickly, and we're saying actually to plan an event, an exhibition really well kind of takes 12 months. So, something you might be thinking of doing 12 months ago actually isn't that exciting by the time it comes to show day. So it's just keeping that in mind.
Some of the interaction that I'll say it because I remember it. It's the first one that just came into my head. I was at a show, I think it was a year ago, probably a little bit more. And a company had an oxygen bar, which was they were flavoured oxygens that you could put a little mask on and do a sort of little oxygen thing on the stand. And there weren't many people doing it. I had a go. It was quite weird. Can't remember what the flavour was. Mint, I think. And it was a memory, wasn't it? You're creating the memory. I do remember what the stand was, and I do remember what they sold. So I guess it worked. So again, as long as it's tied into something underpinned on brand and not too loose and ridiculous, then that can be a great sort of it's technology in the way that you asked me, but it is tied into that because there's an element of sort of technicality to it, which is quite memorable in the same way. So things like that, I think, can sort of just hinge on the edge of technology. But you are right, technology for the sake of it is pretty low key. Don't have the biggest screen because you can afford the biggest screen. Have the biggest screen because you've got really good content. It's not going to pixelate after 10 seconds. That's the killer.
Absolutely. And so I'm just going to pick up on one point you made there about Event Tech Live. So just to let our listeners know, we have a series of Event Tech Live podcasts coming up in November. So we are going to be doing an interview with the event directors down there talking about the show and what it's doing. And we're also doing a podcast with a number of exhibitors as a panel after day one of the show to chat about what they found and what's new on the show floor. So if you're an Event Tech Live exhibitor in November and you would like to be on our podcast, do get in touch, and we would love to invite you along, and we'll be doing that down in London in November. So just kind of looking at rounding off our conversation, so much advice and guidance in there for listeners and for exhibitors, which is fantastic. But can you share with us what has been the most difficult client project you've ever worked on, and how did you overcome the big challenge?
Sometimes the challenge was the client.
Very diplomatic.
Sometimes the challenge was the client's budget, and sometimes the challenge was the client's project. So it is quite difficult. I mean, there are shows that inherently are difficult, and the obvious example for me, having spent quite a lot of time there, is Goodwood Festival of Speed. It's not level. It's I was building stands there with not just me, obviously a big team that were 20 meters by 20 meters, but they were tipping 2.5 meters across the corners. So you spent a week and a half just leveling the site. So there's some operational real hassles on shows like that. You just have to get around. It's also outdoors, so when the lightning comes, you're all off site. There's some there's not many of those shows, but outdoor jobs specifically can be prone with difficulties. As you're probably aware, there's been shows last few years which have been rained off after a day. Especially, Farnborough, Peterborough, there's certain shows they've had which there's been major issues. So weather's never a friend. But in terms of difficult, outdoor challenges aside, there've been some real challenges with geography. So I've built some stands in far off places. Stands have got to be shipped out to Tenerife and that sort of thing. Just small events. They're normally more events than shows, but they still have the same challenges in terms of how the hell are we going to get that done by a certain amount of time or with that amount of people or whatever. So the obvious examples, I guess, are apart from that, are also shows where back-to-back exhibiting is very, very difficult. If you've got a client who just does not have the budget to create 2 stands, but the shows are only 3 days apart, working through the night, it's easy as a salesperson, as a commercial person, because you're not the guy necessarily who's getting his hands dirty, but you still feel very responsible, and those sorts of events can be very, very challenging from a purely logistical point of view. And sometimes the brief is just impossible as well. How on earth do we communicate that using that for that product? It's so maybe dissolved away from what the client actually is that telling the client they're wrong, maybe, I hate to use the word wrong, perhaps wrong, becomes the biggest frustration of the project, because technically the customer's always right, as we say. Well, yes, but if they're new to exhibiting and they're spending a reasonable amount of money, there's a certain bias towards maybe doing what they say, what they say they need or what they want, even if in your heart of hearts they're wrong. Sometimes the honesty can be the most difficult thing to get out of the bag, but usually it pays off in the end. So the challenges sometimes can actually be interpersonal in terms of very large teams who can't make decisions is another classic. Yeah. Very, very regular stuff, and there's nothing personal. It's just some companies just like that, and boardroom decisions can take many, many days, weeks, or months, and still not get to a full conclusion. So an intermixture of both physical and emotional challenges, I suppose, really.
Yeah, and I think just picking up on one of your points there, where you talk about having to tell clients that they're perhaps wrong or misguided or whatever. We've talked a lot in the conversation today about exhibitors that lack kind of the skills and the confidence and the knowledge to be able to deliver exhibitions really well. But there's a whole bank of people in this industry who have been working on exhibitions for years, have seen the problems, dealt with them, overcome, whether it's you as stand designers and experiential builders, and whether it's us as trainers and consultants, wherever somebody is in that kind of process, there's loads of expertise. So if you're an exhibitor who's contracting with an expert to do the job, kind of let them do the job and listen to what they've got to say. And that's sometimes, we have some amazing clients who kind of just suck up all the information that we give them. Yet there's other conversations we have where people go, yeah, but I want this blue elephant that's kind of 15 meters squared on my 3 meter squared stand, and it's like, well, that's clearly not going to work. But no, well, that's what I want. And if you're employing experts, listen to their expertise. I think that's kind of what you've engaged us for.
It is, but just flipping that around the other way, I totally agree, by the way. But there is another school of thought, which is that some of the best ideas sometimes do come from clients because they're not bound with what's gone before. They've not done it before. They have no bias, and that's a really important point, because any event professional, any exhibition professional who's done it all before, in inverted commas, has only done that before. They haven't necessarily built the things that didn't get selected. The jobs they lost maybe they would have been better. So sometimes looking at almost loss analysis for a stand builder designer can be very, very important, because you're obviously looking at it through different eyes, and you're trying to take the personality away from it and think, well, just because we've not done that before doesn't make it wrong. So I think it's the balance of the two, isn't it? It's the balance of the naivety of the exhibitor who's not really been through the process, balanced with the sort of complexities of the memory of the company that maybe thinks it's done everything. You've never done everything. So it's an awkward balance, but usually that can be the best starting point, really, is to balance the team, really, because you are an extension of the client's marketing team.
Absolutely. So, coming to the end of our conversation, and there's been so much advice in there, so it's really, really good chat. I know listeners will have got loads out of it. If you could create an exhibition stand or an event or a piece of experiential for any company or brand in the world, who would you choose?
It is quite a difficult one. I was thinking about this not so long ago, and it's quite challenging because I used to say Lego, and then I built something for Lego. I did a stand design a couple of Christmases ago for a job that eventually got pulled, and it was actually for a January show, and it got pulled actually it didn't get pulled, but we did the job, but the concept changed completely. And my 9-year-old son at the time was not happy, because this was a Minecraft stand, and Daddy was a hero up until Christmas Eve, and then Daddy was an idiot because Daddy wasn't a Minecraft stand anymore at Bet. And it was a horrible thing to have to say. It was a horrible experience, but that was really cool. I'd actually really, really like to do something like that, like a Minecraft stand, or even sort of something through a child's eyes is obviously a really, really good way viewpoint, perspective, etc. as well. So that'd be good. Cadbury's, that'd be nice. Get some loads of free chocolate. But no, brands that are really confident in what they do. And Cadbury's for a different reason is a really good example, because they've got the colour, they obviously got the aroma, they've got various visual idents over 70 years or whatever it is. There's some really strong things to knit into, and that comes back to some of the earlier points of how to do it. Also, why would you want to work with them? Is sometimes the same thing. They've established that sort of trait of what works, and sometimes that's what you're attracted to is things that have clearly worked for them before. So Cadbury's, those sorts of brands would be great. NASA would be quite cool. Never seen NASA do an exhibition stand. Maybe they have. Perhaps I haven't been to Farnborough enough. But things that are inherently cool, drones, teleports, stuff like that. Things that are new to market is always really cool. And that drones obviously has become fairly embedded now, but there'll be new variants of that, obviously, with drone delivery, and we've done some stuff with Uber in the last couple of years, Uber Eats. So there's always examples of things that are genuinely interesting and pretty cool because they're new to market. But actually, the true sort of those best projects, going back to your point earlier about Game of Thrones and other media coming into our media, into our domain. So TV coming into exhibiting is always very, very exciting, because you're bringing something in that feels a bit alien, and that's obviously always a really nice thing to work on. So yeah, I've done lots and lots and lots of projects, as you would expect, but there's still stuff that you don't see, and it's sort of how the hell can we get them to start exhibiting? NASA.
Yeah.
It's going to be NASA now, isn't it? That's just what I'm going to be remembered for.
So NASA, if you're out there and listening, then Andy is the man that you need to speak to.
Especially if NASA are looking at doing some sort of Lego Minecraft Cadbury's hybrid, I'm your man.
Yeah, I'm not kind of sure what that looks like as a product, but let's get creative.
It's, I suppose the quick answer is that all projects are good. Some are gooder.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time today. We have covered so much. So, Andy, if people want to get in touch with you, what is the best way to find you?
Various ways in terms of I'm on LinkedIn is obviously a great one. That's obviously always good. You can find me on there. My name, obviously, Andrew Hickinbotham at GES. You'll find me on there. We can put some links out, I guess, at some stage for you guys. I'm always knocking about on LinkedIn, Twitter, that sort of thing. GES, obviously, my name, Hickinbotham at ges.com. Feel free. So any inquiry source, really, any of those, I'm sure you can help me push those out through this. But always keen to hear from people. And it may well be that you have a question which is in no way commercial, but relates to some of the things we've talked about, going back to that sort of moral, social, sustainability thing. Always very happy to assist on that sort of side, even if there's no project in tow.
Brilliant. Yeah, we will share your links when we publish the podcast, but also if anybody wants to get in touch with Andy and doesn't know how, then of course give us a shout and we will help out. So thank you so much for speaking to us today. Good luck with everything you're doing. What's your next big event that you're working on?
September.
Everything kicks off again in September.
Everything kicks off in September. And the really big events tend to be, BET in January, and there's lots and lots of them, but they run throughout the year. But yeah, August is supposed to be nice and quiet, and then we're back into September, October, November, where it's really busy. Some type of Christmas. So no one big event, because they all grow, which is great. Definitely no complaints. So lots of really good Q3 and Q4 shows coming up. So I would urge people to get out there and visit them, and as we said earlier, and to see what's working well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time. Good luck with all of that, and we will speak to you again in the future.
No problem. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, hopefully you found that conversation inspiring and interesting. Andy is certainly a guy with a lot of experience and a lot we can all learn from. So hopefully you found that useful. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, and our next podcast is with Neil Felton, who is the CEO of FESPA. And if you're not sure of who FESPA are, they are a trade association for the print industry, to put it simply, and we're looking at exhibitions from the perspective of trade associations and how they can help, but also asking Neil about his role with the AEO and the benefits that the AEO bring to the exhibition industry. As we've mentioned in the newsletter and on previous podcasts, we are about to embark on a huge piece of research with actually quite an interesting research partner. So stay tuned to find out who that's going to be. But if you'd like to be part of our research programme, then please do get in touch and we can add you to the list to send you the questionnaire and get in touch with. As always, there's more useful advice, hints and tips over on the website, which is www.inspiringexhibitors.com. And if you can't find what you're looking for there is many ways to get in touch with us via Twitter, LinkedIn and email, which you can find on the website. As we sign off for this week, it's just to say when we come back in 2 weeks' time, it will actually be our first birthday of the podcast, our 25th episode. So we may be doing that one with a little bit of champagne, so apologies if we sound a bit slurry on the next one. But if you need anything in the meantime, please do get in touch, and happy exhibitioning.
Hop over now to inspiringexhibitors.com to subscribe to our newsletters, blogs and future podcasts, keeping you up to date with industry insight. While there, you can also find out more about our new book, The Exhibitionist, Inspiring Trade Show Excellence. Once again, thank you for listening.